My name is David Menton, and I'm going to spend about an hour talking about bones, of all things. I call this talk God's Girders, or to explain precisely what we're going to talk about, our amazing skeleton, which I do believe are well understood as being God's girders. We read about bone in the Bible. Not all the organs of the body are mentioned in the Bible. The Bible's not a book of biology. But when the Bible speaks of things biological, just as when it speaks of things geological and cosmological and what have you, we can trust it. We can trust it to be God's word. Here, Job is giving God credit for the creation of his body and even his skeleton. In Job chapter 10, verses 10 and 11, we read, Job is asking God, "Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese?" Interesting way to look at our development in the womb. And then he says, "And clothe me with skin and flesh," and here it is, "and knit me together with bones and sinews." The sinews would be the ligaments and the tendons that attach the muscles to the bones and attach bones one to another. And that expression knit comes up all the time. We're knit together in our mother's womb, the Bible tells us. My area of expertise when I was in my profession at a medical school was a field called histology. And that word comes from a Latin word histos. It means a web or a fabric. So histology is the study of webs and fabrics. Looking through microscopes is what we call histology. And things do look woven. So that's a good name for it, webs and fabrics. Well, let's look at the building we're in right now. I'm at the Creation Museum, and this is when the Creation Museum was under construction. And it's pretty much just framework at this stage yet, but it kind of shows that buildings themselves have a skeleton, and we call them I-beams that we see up there at the top. I-beams running along, and then these little structures going this way are girders. We can zoom in on those girders and you'll see something pretty familiar if you've looked not only at buildings under construction, but even when you look up in the ceiling of auditoria like this, sometimes you can actually see these structures. And if we zoom in a little more on one of them right there, magnify that, getting ahead of ourselves here. Zoom in on that. It's called a Warren's Truss. And they say a Warren's Truss is the strongest kind of truss that can be made for a given amount of steel. Nobody's come up with a way to make a stronger truss that weighs less, that uses less material. And it's familiar to you as a kind of a series of triangles between two bars. Now, did they tell you there was going to be an exam? Oh yeah, we teachers don't get paid a whole lot, and one of our few joys in life is persecuting students with exams. So here's a question I have for you. Have any idea who designed Warren's Truss? Yeah, you would think Warren, wouldn't you? Well, he got the credit for it, but I'm going to show you a picture from a vulture, a bone from a vulture, and the bone I'll show you is a bone right here in the palm. And this bone in the palm is called a metacarpal bone, and we're going to saw down the length of the metacarpal bone in the wing of a vulture. And when we do that, we get this. It looks like a Warren's Truss, doesn't it? Except God made this truss. I think I'm going to refer to it as God's truss from now instead of just Warren's Truss. Well, all kinds of vertebrates, of course, have bones. That's what vertebrate means, creatures that have vertebrae. Here is Watson. Watson is a basset hound. This was taken when he was a puppy, and Watson grew up to be a pretty good-sized dog, very heavy, but his legs, of course, were very short. Long ears and short legs, that's a characteristic of a basset hound. Makes you kind of wonder why those legs didn't grow longer. Compare that to an Irish elk hound or greyhound or something like that with such long legs. What determines how long the leg will be? Well, we'll get into that as we move along here. Can you imagine what life would be like without bones? We have a an example to show you here what we might look like. We'd be a puddle. And being a puddle would not be our biggest problem. Our biggest problem could be quite a number of things worse than being a puddle. Let's look at the functions of bones. They're mechanical support. They hold us up. You can see that from the picture of the collapsed gentleman. They are protective. Think of the bone around our brain that protects the brain, the vault of the skull. The ribs protect, together with the sternum, the heart, and the lungs, and the contents of our chest. Bones work as levers that get mechanical advantage. Muscles hook up to them, and they have hinges or a fulcrum, and work as a lever that allows movement of our body, our limbs, and our legs. Blood is made inside of bone. We overlook some of these things. How important is blood? I think that would rank higher in importance than being a puddle. The Bible says the blood is the life. With no blood, you can't possibly survive. So blood, both red cells and white cells, are made in the bone marrow. And then this is something you may not have heard of, but it's just as important as blood, and that's calcium homeostasis. Wow, that's a word. That means maintaining the calcium levels in our body at reasonable levels. And this is important because calcium plays a number of roles. You know bones are made of calcium, so that's a good source for calcium, or storage form. But the glue that holds our body together, cell adhesion proteins, depend on calcium. Calcium is involved in the regulation of muscle contraction. If there was no calcium available, we couldn't contract our muscles. They would just go flaccid. If there was too much calcium, we'd probably go into tetany, or our muscles would lock up. Cells have to talk to one another. They just can't behave as a bunch of individuals. We've got 30 trillion cells in our body, and they have to be in communication. And communication between cells involves calcium as well. Well, the largest bone in our body is the femur. That's the one in the upper part of our leg. Do you know what the smallest bone in the body is? Boy, it wins by a huge margin. These three little bones that we have in our ear, way inside in what we call the middle ear, and the first one there, number one, is called the malleus, or the hammer. It's kind of shaped like a crude hammer. And two is often called the anvil, or the incus. I think they needed an anvil to go with a hammer. I'm not sure this looks like an anvil. But number three here, the stapes, which means stirrup, really does look like a stirrup. It has a foot plate, everything. This little bone is being compared to a dime. Look how small it is compared to a dime. It's 3/10 of an inch long, and it weighs 1/10,000th of an ounce. It's by far the smallest bone in the body. And you might wonder, what are these little bones doing, such tiny bones? Well, they're in what we call our middle ear, and they're located right there in the circle. And what they do is really fascinating. Sound is transmitted through air. In vacuum, you can't have sound. It needs air molecules. And these air molecules hit the eardrum, causing it to vibrate, just like the membrane on a microphone will vibrate when we talk into it. And that causes these little bones to wiggle. And at the end where the stirrup is, the foot plate fits into an oval window here, that's called the oval window, by the way. And that's attached to an organ here, the cochlea. That means snail shell, and it really does look like a snail shell. So sound is going through air, then it's going through these bones, and then it goes into the water, mostly water, inside of the cochlea, because these cells that do the hearing need to be in a warm, liquid environment so they don't dry out. The problem is when sound goes from air to water, there's an impedance mismatch. A lot of the energy is lost. In fact, going from air to water, about 99.9% of the sound energy does not enter the water. It reflects off. That's why if you're in a swimming pool or at the lake, you're underwater, you can't hear somebody yelling even outside. So what these little bones are doing for us here is they're restoring a lot of that energy loss that we would otherwise have. And the sound vibrates the bones make the little foot go in and out of that oval window, and that changes the flow of liquid inside this cochlea, and that finally becomes sound. Well, when we're born, we have really more bones than we have as an adult. It may be surprising to you, but we have a lot of bones in our body that come in separate pieces. The hip bone, for example, is really 3 different bones: ilium, ischium, and pubic bone. So we'd count that as 3, but they fuse together during development. So whereas a baby has about 270 bones in its body, an adult has about 107. Or 207, I should say, 206, 207, depending how many bones you have in your tailbone or coccyx. Our skeleton really begins as cartilage. You're familiar with cartilage. This is cartilage in your ear. It's wiggly, it bends. It's like hard rubber or some kind of rubber. We have cartilage in our nose. We have cartilage several places in our body. And almost all the bones of our body begin while we're in the womb as cartilage. And bone begins to form at about 6 weeks of development and isn't complete until about 21 years of age before the last conversion of cartilage to bone takes place. There's 2 components of bone, should make it easy to understand, just 2 materials, 2 kinds of material. There's the organic matrix. Organic simply means carbon containing. And it makes up about 30% of the dry weight of a bone. So if you had a dried bone here and you weighed it, 30% of that dry weight would be organic material, and most of that, 95% of it, would be a protein called collagen. Collagen is what you see when you look at a piece of leather. That's all collagen, woven in the leather. So think of it, 30% of the dry weight of a bone is basically leather blended into the bony material. And then 70% of the dry weight, quite a bit more, is inorganic material. Inorganic materials are typically salts and things like that. And the most common inorganic material in our bone is calcium, but there are also other mineral salts as well, as you can see in the picture here. These mineral salts tend to form a special type of crystal that we see both in geology and in biology, and it's called hydroxyapatite. It's by far the hardest material in our body. We have almost pure hydroxyapatite on the enamel of our teeth. So our teeth enamel, that coating on the surface, is just about completely permineralized or mineralized. When you think about it, that means the enamel in our mouth is one part of our body that's fossilized, completely fossilized, while we're still alive. Well, we have these 2 materials, and together, the organic and the inorganic, they form something called a composite material. And you may have done an experiment showing the composite nature of bone. Composites, things like fiberglass are composites. You have a fiber wool, a glass wool, and then a glass resin, and the 2 together makes a very good boat hull, a fiberglass boat hull. But if you just use the resin, let that harden up without the wool, the glass wool, it would be brittle and break. And if you just use the glass wool, it wouldn't hold water, it would leak. But you put the 2 together, you get what we call a composite. And bone is a wonderful composite. For example, here is some reinforced concrete. The one on the left there looks like it's getting to be a little dangerous. That's called rebar, those metal bars in there. And the rebar greatly increases the strength of concrete. You can also see the rebar rods over here in the other piece of concrete. What if you made a bridge out of concrete and you left the rebar out? When the truck went over, crunch, it would just break. What if you made the bridge out of the rebar and you left the concrete out? The truck would go over the bridge and it would bend. But you put the 2 together and you get something new called a composite. And God is a master of composites, because our bone, as we'll see, truly is a marvelous composite. In fact, you may have done this experiment with a chicken leg. A lot of people do this as a science experiment. You can get like 3 chicken legs. That's the hardest part of the whole experiment, finding a 3-legged chicken, but once you got that, you're on your way. You take one of the chicken leg bones, just the bone, you get to eat the meat off, and you put it in vinegar for a couple of weeks, completely submerged in vinegar. After a couple of weeks, the mineral will have dissolved because of the acid in the vinegar, and you can tie this bone in a knot. It looks like nothing happened. The bone looks pretty much the same as it did before, except the mineral's gone. You basically end up with a leather bone. Try this with a chicken leg bone. And then if you wanted to see what bone would be like if it was only mineral and no organic material, you can get rid of the organic material by taking the chicken leg and putting it on a charcoal grill and burning off basically all the collagen. It's like burning up a pair of leather gloves. That stuff burns collagen. And you'll be left with 100% mineral bone after it cools. That's important, after it cools. If you take that bone and you hit it on something hard, it'll just shatter. So it's very hard, but it's brittle. But again, God's composite of using collagen, basically leather, with mineral, hydroxyapatite, putting the two together, producing something that's extraordinarily hard. In fact, bone, the strength of bone is approximately that of cast iron, pound for pound, about the same as cast iron. Here you can see some people living in rural Romania. They're making bricks as a composite material. They have a little form there, and they put straw down into that form, and then they add the clay. And the two together make a much stronger brick than if you just made it out of clay, and of course much stronger than if you just made it out of straw. But the two together, straw, clay, make a strong brick. There's an interesting story behind that. The whole thing with the children of Israel, having been captive in Egypt for 400 years, Pharaoh decided he was going to make things more difficult for them because they wanted to go out and worship their God, get away from Pharaoh for a while. Pharaoh didn't allow it, led to the plagues. But Pharaoh had given the children of Israel a quota. They had to make so many bricks a day in one of the storage cities of Pharaoh. And the quota was just at the level of human endurance. You could just get that many made, and that was it. They used to bring the straw to the children of Israel as they made brick, but Pharaoh decided to make them find their own straw. So now they had to go out and hunt up all the straw and yet keep the same quota of bricks made of a combination of clay and straw. They went to Moses and ultimately to God and said, "There's no straw given to your servants," and they say to us, "Make brick." Well, you know how that all turned out. They were unable to do it, and thanks be to God, they were allowed to leave the promised land, or the bondage, and go to the promised land. Well, we said there were two types of material in bone, the organic, the inorganic. There are basically two types of cells that are important in bone. One's called the osteoblast, and when you see that word blast associated with a cell, it means a cell that's still producing or making something. So, for example, an erythroblast is a cell that's making hemoglobin before it's released into the bloodstream. Once it gets out in the bloodstream, it's not making hemoglobin anymore. In fact, it loses its nucleus. It's basically not even alive. Then we call it an erythrocyte. So an osteoblast is a cell that is secreting the organic matrix or component of bone. The mineral comes out of the tissue fluids, gets attracted to this organic material, so it sets up sort of like plaster. Well, we have the osteoblast, and then there's another cell type called the osteoclast. The osteoclast removes bone. You could say we have a bone maker and a bone breaker. Probably wonder, why would you even want a cell that would remove bone? You make the bone, leave it alone. Well, it turns out that at least since the fall, little microfractures and things happen in the bone, and these need to be repaired. And so bone is being constantly removed and replaced, removed and replaced. And so the osteoclast removes some bone, the osteoblast put it back. Osteoblast remove, osteoblast put it back. This is called turnover, and many things in our body, practically everything, has a cell turnover time. It's been said that the bones of your body are completely replaced in about 15 years. So after 15 years, there's probably nothing in your body that was there 15 years earlier. You realize what that means? I'm 15. Yeah, if you're talking about the age of the meat, of the body, we really don't have anything older than that. In fact, our skin cells are on the surface are only about a month old, and red blood cells only last about 120 days before they're replaced. The lining of the GI tract turns over in 4 days, so wow, we should live forever, shouldn't we, at that rate? But we don't. Something went wrong. You know what it is, sin. It took a beautiful body designed to last forever and left us with our 70, or if by reason of strength 80. This is what the cells look like. The cells that are being pointed to here with a green arrow, these are the osteoblasts that make that bone. At first it's called osteoid because it's soft, but then it attracts mineral from the tissue fluids and becomes hard bone. And then we have this big cell here. That's the osteoclast. And it actually is several cells that have fused together to form a kind of a giant cell, if you will. We call it a syncytium. So these have the ability to dissolve not only the mineral, but also the organic material of bone. You can see it's removed a little piece of bone right here. Well, how do bones grow? They start out as a piece of cartilage. Over there on the left, what you see in white here is just solid cartilage, and cartilage can't stand blood vessels. So blood vessels have to keep their distance. But eventually, blood vessels do encroach on this little cartilage model of a bone. And when they do, bone is formed in the center here. You can see a vessel coming in here. And that's called the primary center of ossification. So that's where the bone begins to form, is in the center. Then blood vessels will enter the cartilage at each end of the bone. This is a little cartilage knob at each end. And we'll get a secondary center of mineral formation. But as long as we keep a little plate of cartilage right in the middle here, between the end and the shaft, this bone can continue to grow in length. And that explains why some dogs have long legs and some have short legs. These are called growth plates. And as long as the growth plate is active, the leg can grow in length. Well, once it ceases to be active, it gets converted into bone, there's no cartilage left, then there's no further growth in the length of bone. So for bone to grow from a shape like you see in the blue outline to grow to the size that it is out here, we had to remove some bone here, and we had to add some here. So there's a constant necessity to remove bone and add bone so that bone can change its shape and its size. We usually don't think of bone changing its shape and size, but bone's very dynamic. When we put load on bone, it tends to become stronger. We have a bump behind our ear called the mastoid process. There's a muscle that goes from your sternum here and clavicle up to that. That's the muscle that lifts your head. When a baby's born, they start working on lifting their head. And that tendon that goes into the bone back here causes the bone to build up mass to keep that tendon from being pulled out. And we can feel that bump. That developed after we were born, the mastoid process right behind. Well, this is the bones of a foot. There's 26 bones in just one foot. So a lot of bones, 27 bones in your hand, 33 bones in your vertebra of your body. And so we even have a huge number of bones that make up the skull, over 20 bones to just make up the skull. These have all fused together. Well, cartilage would be, for example, that part of the foot, and these are the tarsal bones of the foot, and this bone out here, metatarsal bone, would just be starting to go from cartilage to bone. And the cartilage isn't turned into bone, the cartilage is replaced by bone. Let's look at a little piece of toe bone from a developing human fetus. This is just one small bone from the toe. And you can see this is cartilage at both ends. Cartilage has no blood vessels. It's anaerobic tissue. This is very unusual. Not many things in our body are truly anaerobic that get no blood supply, but that's true of cartilage. But cartilage has the advantage it can grow from within. We call that interstitial growth. It can get bigger by growing at the surface as well as inside as cells divide. Whereas bone, like plaster, could only grow at the surface. You have to add it to an already existing surface. So a blood vessel gets a little close, causes the cartilage cells to break down and die, and we get a center of bone formation right in the middle here, keeping cartilage at both ends. Here's a little later period of time when that primary center of bone formation is expanded. We still have cartilage at both ends. Pretty soon there would be a secondary center that would develop in each end, and that would make the ends of the bone. And by leaving a plate of cartilage in the middle, right in here, we would have what we call a growth plate. We also keep cartilage on the ends of our bones that forms the joint. We call that articular cartilage. And it's nice and slippery. There's a seal, so it's a sealed chamber. And it has an oil-like material in there that lubricates. So the cartilage is slippery. It has that lubricant and makes the joint freely flexible. Sadly, since the fall, people can get diseases where the cartilage is lost or damaged, and then we get bone on bone, and that's a pretty painful experience. If we take an area that you see there in the blue box and we magnify it to see what that cartilage looks like, here it is under the microscope. So the cartilage is on the top up there, the bone is in the bottom. That's at the end of a long bone. And this cartilage, hopefully, will never be lost. It'll be retained throughout life. It forms a kind of a cushion between the joints. It's slippery. There's a lubricant in the joint space here, and should give us a nice, freely moving joint as long as we don't lose the cartilage. Here's a tibia and fibula, the lowest part of the leg. There's an X-ray, and in this X-ray, we can see that there is something called an epiphyseal plate. That's the growth plate. As long as this individual has that growth plate, growth hormone will allow their legs and their body to get bigger, to get longer. But here you see that cartilage growth plate. It goes from here to here. This is bone down here. The cartilage breaks down, forms what we call calcified cartilage. It's a kind of a very short-lived, soluble type of material, but it makes a good anchor on which to deposit bone. So bone is placed on top of these little beams of calcified cartilage coming off this growth plate. And by this growth plate continually trying to get thicker, but having its thickness checked by being replaced by bone, it allows our leg to grow longer and longer. Well, this is actually a human femur. It's the distal end towards the knee. And this is from an individual who was about probably my age when he died. And you can see where the growth plate used to be, right here. See, that looks like a dove flying. And so if you were to administer growth hormone to somebody of that age, they would not get any taller. If they were a child and still had the growth plates, they would get taller and taller. If your growth plates have already just been replaced with bone, growth hormone will not influence. Bones can get thicker, like your fingers could get thicker with high growth hormone, but they wouldn't get longer. So this individual has reached maximum age. The reason the basset hound has shorter legs, its growth plates quit working earlier than the greyhound, where you get the long leg. But what's really interesting here, look at this bone on the edge. We call this compact bone. That makes bone a kind of a tube. And then we look in here, and this spongy-looking bone here is called, guess what? Spongy bone. Isn't that a good name for it? Sometimes it's called trabecular bone, but spongy bone is kind of works for me. Notice the spongy bone isn't just any old way. It's arranged in palisades or columns. You see it here? And all the weight on the knee is hitting right on that surface, and those palisades or columns of spongy bone are perpendicular to that line of force. And that makes spongy bone very strong, and yet not be so heavy as if the bones were all just solid bone. The bones are hollow. We have marrow being made, at least in younger people, in bone here. But this is all spongy bone. It gives strength without adding to the weight. We see that sometimes when we make a table or a shelf out of wood, and we put too much weight on that wooden shelf, and you know what happens, it bends. But we can keep that from happening, not by making a thicker shelf. That's a wasteful way to go about things. We can just cut another piece of the same stock as we have at the ends, put it in the middle, and that'll support the weight very nicely. That's the whole principle we're talking about here with these columns of bone lined up with the direction of the force that comes to bear. And these bone pieces, these little palisades, the spongy bone, can change its shape over time. Osteoclasts erode part of it, osteoblasts add bone, so the whole orientation can change. For example, when a lady becomes pregnant, got about 20 pounds of weight out here that hasn't been there before, the spongy bone in her thighs, legs, hips, what have you, can all reorient, remodel to be optimized, oriented in the best possible way to bear the force coming to bear. So that's pretty remarkable. God made bones that aren't like plaster or stone. They're dynamic, they're alive, they're growing, they can change their shape to best accommodate the forces that are being brought to bear on it. It's believed this is accomplished in part by electrical signals. When bone is bent, it actually, even dead bone, when it's bent, gives off an electrical charge. It's called a piezoelectric effect. And it's believed those electrical charges recruit the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts to come in and change the shape of the bone itself. So here's a higher power view. You can see how the spongy bone is arranged in columns that are perpendicular to the lines of force. And as I say, these can change in their orientation. And that's the growth plate right there. Well, the bone I've been showing you is from the femur. This is the other end of the femur. You can see similar spongy bone. To the left there, you see a drawing that shows how the beams are arranged. They are arches that intersect from both sides. And this gives the neck of the femur and that end of the femur a great deal of strength. In fact, the Eiffel Tower, the person who designed the Eiffel Tower used the architecture of the femur, I'm told, to design these arches that intersect down here in the base of the tower. And then if we look at that area that you see in blue there, we have compact bone and spongy bone close together. Let's magnify that and take a look at it. Here is the compact bone over here, and everything else is spongy bone to the left of it. Just think those spaces are filled in with living cells and fluids and what have you. It's not air in there. It is all liquid or cellular. And the compact bone is alive too, and you wonder, where are the cells in this compact bone? Well, if we were to just take a section and look at the wall here from, say, in here out to here, in this illustration, we can see what the wall of compact bone looks like. This would be outside the bone, out here. This would be inside the bone, and we're just looking at the wall of this cylinder that makes up the cortical bone or compact bone. And in this model, we can see that bone is very vascular, even this dense compact bone. All these red lines are blood vessels. They run along the length of the bone as well as going from vessel to vessel across it. Notice the basic architecture of bone, of compact bone, is really a lot of cylindrical structures put in there together. We can see them here. This is sort of like if you were able to go in and carve the bone out to show these cylindrical structures protruding. You would see something that looks like this. There would be several layers to it. And in the middle is a hole, and in that hole in the center, there are blood vessels. And so that's how each of these tube-like structures gets its blood supply. We call these bony tubes osteons. That's the sort of functional unit of compact bone. And so this is an osteon, this is one, here's one here, here's another. And you might wonder, how did those tubular structures of bone ever get in there? What happens is an osteoclast drills a hole. One osteoclast, they say, can keep up with about 100 osteoblasts. So an osteoclast or two can burrow a hole right into compact bone. So we could drill a hole, say, right here, this big around. And then a blood vessel drops into that hole, bringing with it bone-forming cells, the progenitor cells of bone. They then start making bone from the wall of this hole or cylinder that you burrowed out of the bone, and they build in towards the center, and they stop short of filling it with bone. That's where the blood vessel will run down the center. Notice in the picture here, you see what looks like a worm gear almost, a bunch of fibers going different directions. That's showing you that there are really just dozens of concentric rings of collagen, leather fibers, that are running through the bones. So unlike the bricks that are made with straw, the straw is in there just any old way. When God makes brick, it's a whole different story. Each layer of the collagen is oriented different than the next. This is like plywood. And this orientation is changing constantly as you go down through the bone, all different directions, and it gives bone a tremendous strength due to this Haversian system, or this osteon arrangement. Out here we have the connective tissue that forms the surface of the bone. It's called the periosteum. It's a tough fibrous material that attaches down to the bone very, very tightly. Well, let's get a more magnified view of what we're looking at there. Here we're looking at the bone straight in from the top, and this would be one Haversian system, or osteon. Haversian is also another name for it, lots of synonyms. The canal in the middle is called the Haversian Canal. It was named after Clopton Havers. Interesting story there. Clopton Havers, many, many years ago, when people were beginning to look at bone in the microscope, he saw those little holes in cross sections of bone like this, and they became known as Haversian canals after Clopton Havers. And he thought that they were responsible for the sweat that occurs on our forehead, that the sweats would somehow come up in the body and go through these little holes and come out on the forehead. So people over time, even scientists, can be very wrong in their understanding of something, and they have to constantly update and change. God's word is always the same. Have you noticed that? Years ago when I was in graduate school, I got a set of books. It was titled Cell Biology, published by Academic Press, very expensive. Or it was called The Cell. That was what the set was called. There were 4 volumes called The Cell. And these 4 volumes basically taught us everything we knew, or told us everything we knew about the cell at that time. This is back in the early 60s. Well, by the time I graduated from grad school, these books were already out of date. I ended up throwing 3 of the 4 away. I kept one of them. And that one that I kept, I like to put right next to my Bible on the bookshelf. The one on the cell is so out of date that it's really not even a useful book to read anymore. And the Bible is still spot on. God's word is changeless, and it's always true. So that reminds me, the science book, God's book, side by side, keep things in perspective. So here are those concentric rings of collagen fibers, and then there are cells. These little spaces here are called lacunae. There's a cell that would be in each of those, and those cells would be osteocytes. So they wouldn't be osteoblasts. They're not making bone anymore. They're buried in bone. As they formed bone, a lot of these osteoblasts got themselves buried, sort of like flies in ointment. Boy, if you're buried in concrete, you'd have a few problems. One would be breathing, and the other would be getting food, nutrients in, waste products out. So how does a cell that's alive, buried in something as hard as cast iron, how does it stay alive? How does it get its nutrition? How does it get its oxygen? Well, it all has to come from the blood vessel in the center here. And it has to go from the center through little canals, so tiny we call them canaliculae. And these little canals go all the way out to the edge of this osteon from here to here. So over here, the same thing. Little canals would go out, and you would see several layers of osteocyte cells in there. These osteocytes are probably involved in mineral homeostasis. They're adjusting the amount of calcium in our body, which is very critical. It's not something we have control over, thank the Lord. It's all automatic. Notice in some places the vessels not only go through the middle of these little canals, Haversian canals, but they also have branches that go off to the neighbor. We call these Volkmann's canals when they go crossways, Haversian canals when they go longitudinal. You're probably wondering, how did we get this bone in the middle? You know how we got the cylinder? A hole was drilled by an osteoclast and was filled from the outside in. But how did you get the bone in all these places? These are parts of old osteons that were drilled into to create the new ones. So these are older osteons here. These are the most recent ones here, and they overlap because they were drilled into these structures. So as a result, compact bone is truly compact. It's not like spongy bone with a lot of beams and processes. Let's take one osteon and magnify it, only not in a model, in a real human bone. And here it is. That hole in the middle, that's where you would have a small blood vessel, like a capillary, 1 or 2 would be in there. That would provide the nutrients. These little spaces out here would contain the osteocytes that got themselves buried as they laid down osteoid, got left behind, buried in cement, and they have to communicate with the other cells and get the nutrition all the way from this source down here. How do they do that? Well, let's magnify this a little bit. Now you notice it looks like a lot of spider legs coming off from each one of these lacuna. This would hold one osteocyte here. And these little processes are cell processes from the osteocyte. There would be hundreds of them probably per cell, going out in all directions, passing through tiny little canals in the bone. And the osteocytes, or the processes from one osteocyte, meet and touch in these little canaliculi, processes coming from the next neighbor. And the nutrients and signals, electrical signals and what have you, are passed from cell to cell all the way out to the periphery of the osteon. So you couldn't even count how many little canals and processes there are here. And this is like a bucket brigade. This cell here would pick up nutrients from this blood vessel, and with its processes would pass it to the processes of this cell, which would pass it to the next, all the way out. Let's crank up the power a little more here and look at this little lacuna right here. In life, there would have been a cell in there, an osteocyte with lots of processes. Everything else would be layers of collagen and hydroxyapatite mineral, that composite material, combined together very, very intimately. Well, what would a cell look like that resides in a little space like this? I took a scanning electron micrograph of one of these cells some years ago. Here's an osteocyte. You can see some of its processes. There would be many, many more than this. And this is the lacuna in which the cell sits. And this stuff that looks like straw out here, those are the collagen fibers, and then embedded right into those fibers, sort of married into the fiber, is this mineral hydroxyapatite. And it's believed that that combination of collagen, which is like leather, and the hydroxyapatite, when that's bent, can produce electrical charges that recruit osteoblasts and osteoclasts and allow bones to change in shape and increase in strength or lose their strength over a period of time. Well, we couldn't do a whole lecture on bone without talking about the famous tailbone. I don't like the name tailbone because that bone is not a tail. Its proper name is the coccyx, named after a beak on a bird. And we see it located right down on the end. Evolutionists like to point out that that is a vestigial organ. It has no function today. It's merely a leftover from our tailed ancestors. Well, they say we evolved from ape-like creatures, and apes don't have a tail either. So I guess this would have to go back to our monkey ancestors that preceded our ape ancestors. I hope you understand, I don't believe any of this. But what about that coccyx or tailbone not having any function? I read that all the time. There's no excuse for anyone to say that anymore. Let me just give you an idea what the function is. This whole area here, this is the pelvis. This is the pelvic inlet right here. During childbirth, the baby's head would fit down and pretty much fill this area. And this pelvis would have to open up a bit by softening the joints, which happens during delivery. Allows the 3 bones on each side of the pelvis to open a little more to just allow the baby through. But what is the coccyx doing? Well, it's not just sitting there reminiscing about the past. It's a set of 3 or 4 fused bones. Some may be incompletely fused, but there are a lot of muscles that attach to the coccyx. In fact, if we were to say how important and functional a bone is based on how many muscles attach to that bone coming from how many different directions, the tailbone might win as one of the most functional bones in the body. Let me show you what's attached there. You're now looking down at the pelvis, seeing muscles that make the floor of the pelvis. We call this the pelvic diaphragm. Everything from the urethra, anus, vagina in the case of females, rectum, all go through this area here. And this forms a muscular floor on our pelvis. There's a pair of muscles coming in here called the pubococcygeus. We can see those. Here's the tailbone itself, or coccyx. And here are the 2 pubococcygeus muscles that come in. Then there's a fan-shaped muscle coming in from the hip bones there called the iliococcygeus. And then there's another pair of muscles all tying into the coccyx or tailbone called the coccygeus muscles. Here are 6 muscles. There are actually more involved in this. And they all critically anchor on that coccyx. You can see it in their name, pubococcygeus, iliococcygeus, coccygeus muscle. And what is the function of that muscular floor? Well, the pelvis has a number of things in it. It has the uterus in the case of females. It has the urinary bladder. It's a busy area. And because we stand upright, we need to have a pelvic floor that keeps these pelvic organs in place. The rectum is also in this area. So that is a muscular floor, which if it were not there, nothing would impede the organs of our pelvic region just literally passing down between our legs. So a very functional organ. And with so many muscles coming from so many different directions attaching to that bone, that explains why if you've ever fallen on your so-called tailbone, it really hurts, right? In fact, I always say when you fall on your coccyx, there's 3 positions you cannot bear to be in. One is standing, one is sitting, and the other's lying down. All 3 are just too painful to endure. So that's because this bone has muscles attached to it, pulling all these different directions. Well, God has given us a wonderful skeleton, wonderful muscles to move this great skeleton. The Bible has a lot to say about the bones of Jesus Christ. Did you know that? We go back into the Psalms, Psalm chapter 6, verse 2. We find that the Lord heals our troubled bones. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are troubled. And you know who healed our troubled bones, don't you? Jesus Christ, by enduring a lot of troubled bones of his own. Look at Psalm 22, verse 14. These are the very thoughts of Jesus Christ on the cross. All way back here in the Old Testament, Psalm 22, Jesus told the disciples that were on their way to Emmaus after his resurrection, they were all downtrodden because they thought Jesus was dead and that was the end of him. And Jesus caught up with them, and he opened up the Old Testament to these gentlemen on the way to Emmaus and told them that the Old Testament was about him. It was about Jesus Christ. And look at this, as Jesus is on the cross, just think of this. He says, I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. The whole process of crucifixion involved having the arms pulled up high like this. That raises the chest bones, makes it hard to breathe. It's like hanging by your arms. Try that sometime from a bar, hang by your arms and see how hard it is to breathe. Because normally we change the size of our chest by lifting and lowering our ribs, but we don't have that motion when we're hanging in that way. To hasten death, what they would do is break the legs so that the person on the cross could no longer support their own weight. And then it was just literally dead weight hanging, and death would follow very quickly. Jesus goes on to say, Psalm 22, verse 17, I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. Think of it as Christ hung on the cross. He could see the people, the stares, the taunts. And he could count the bones in his body. They all hurt so much. And then when we go to the New Testament, John 19:36, it says, for these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. Foretold in the Old Testament. And at every Jewish Passover, that paschal lamb that is offered there and eaten, it was one of the rules that they follow to this day, to not break any of the bones in the lamb's body. Well, what a Savior we have. How much he suffered for us to save us from sin, death, and the power of Satan.